So yes, I'm so excited. I hope you all managed a relaxing break, and we're here again to kick off for 2022 with our guest rock star, Lucy Potter. So Lucy is a professional geologist with over 20 years in the mineral exploration and mining industry. She's worked with major and junior companies in base and precious metals across Asia, Africa, Australia, and the Americas. So I'm thrilled that she's joined us in the hot seat today to present Snakes, Ladders, and Seduction. So I hope you all enjoy it. And yeah, thank you so much, Lucy. It's just wonderful having you.
Awesome. I'm happy to be here, Jess, and thank you for the invitation. Thanks to everybody who took time out of their day to be here. And a special thanks to people who it's your evening time, your precious time with your families or for leisure activities. And thank you for joining. And anyone who's watching the recording later on, well, good on you for following up afterwards. So I'll just get my screen shared here. Okay, so again, thank you everyone for being here. It would be really nice if we could see each other in person and have it, make a day of it to be able to chat and have a conversation back and forth. But instead, I get to blab for an hour, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion after the fact. So the format we're going to go with today is I'm going to start with a short poll. Very easy, no tricky questions for you, no Olympic questions to start. And then I have a very short safety share to make. Then I'm going to go through the rules of the game, which is essentially a disclaimer. Before my presentation, I'm going to talk about who the players are or who's involved in this game of Snakes, Ladders, and Seduction. And for anyone who's not familiar with this vintage board game, it's pretty simple. You get as many players as are interested to start on square one, roll the die, and then go back and forth, left to right, up and down until you get to 100. And whoever arrives here first is the winner. But along the way, you have some snakes that kind of trip you up and send you backwards, and then you have ladders that are helpful and help you get to the goal more easily and more quickly. So in a resource geologist job, this is the reality, is that we have some things that help us along our journey, and then there are other things that really set you back. So what I want to do today is just share some of my experience of things that I've seen, things that I've done, and what I've learned from all of that. So we're going to start here, Jess, with the poll. So we'll come in, and if you have those questions, very simple. First one is, where are you joining in from today? All right, as expected, the bulk of you are in Australia, so welcome, and thanks to the North Americans and South Americans who made it as well. I did try and convince and bribe a few of my friends and over here in Canada to support me this evening. So that's cool. Next question is, where are you working? So what part of the industry are you in? Mining company, be it academia, government, NGO? Okay. Most of the people are in mining and exploration. Very good. And then a few from each of the other groups. Awesome. And last question is, what is your level of comfort or familiarity with mineral resource geology? So you're either at the top, where you're very experienced, qualified person, to maybe someone who's a newbie and doesn't know much about mineral resources at all. Awesome. So quite a spread, lots of experts on the line. Hope I don't say anything too offensive that anyone disagrees with, but again, you'll have your chance to dispute me or to add your own experience at the end. And I would guess that some of the things I'll share, you'll have a chuckle at, and you've probably seen these types of mistakes as well in your career. And so maybe you'll have other horrors to share with the group. In terms of a safety share. It's not exactly safety share, but I did want to just take a moment to maybe have an inclusion share for everyone today. So what I would ask of you is, if you have a meeting later today or tomorrow with a group of people, to try and draw out or include someone in the group who might not necessarily be as frequently involved or as included. So there are those people who might be a bit more diverse, the kind of edge characters. Try and ask for their opinion, ask for them to join in the conversation, and give them an opportunity to voice whatever different idea or different opinion they might have to say. So that's your homework to do after today's GeoHug. Okay, so next is going to be the game. So my disclaimer is this: it's not a legal disclaimer. It's just to let you know that everything I'm sharing with you today is real. These are things that I've seen, that I've read in the public domain, things that I've done, mistakes I might have made. But everything's been kind of skewed or flipped upside down, coordinates changed so that nothing is recognizable. I'm not here to point fingers at anyone. It's really just to learn from each other's mistakes, and to not make mistakes, or to correct mistakes before they get to that, critical level of people spending millions of dollars on them and making investment decisions. So we really need to learn as much as we can ahead of time. It's not a training that I'm giving today either. Becoming a resource geologist takes years and years. And when you're just starting out your career, you might know just enough to be kind of dangerous with your knowledge and your skills. So, and this is why our professional associations require us to have a minimum number of years of relevant experience. So really just a high level overview that I'm sharing with you today. And then the last point I'll raise, it's not a disclaimer so much as a credit that I want to give to all the people who've helped me learn different things. And there might be some of you on the line today that have shared your knowledge with me, that you see things that we've developed or thought up together. So my journey has a lot of props to give to people who've helped me, and that I just want to acknowledge them. Okay, so now who are the players in this game? The first one is the geologist. So if we zoom in here, what is the profile of a resource geologist? So typically they work in consulting. It could be a big firm, small firm, or maybe an independent, or often they work for a mining or exploration company. Most of the ones that I know are self-taught, so they learn on the job from a mentor, they learn by doing, and then some people have been to do postgraduate studies at a university program to really learn more advanced geostatistics. And both routes are great. I know people who've done both of those, and it makes for a nice mix of people who have different ways that they came to be resource geologists. Resource geologists have a lot of really great personality characteristics. I think what attracts people to the field is that they like solving problems. They like finding problems, as I do, finding mistakes and then trying to correct them. Obviously, people who like geology have an interest in numbers and math and statistics. People who like to learn new things. Your job learning resource geology is never finished. So there's always something new to learn about different commodities or different types of deposits. It's really important to be resourceful and collaborative. Part of your job is working with different kinds of people. So you need to be open to learning from them. Communication, like many other careers, is really important because you have to be able to communicate to a wide range of people, from very technical, so explain and justify decisions that you're making in your work, but also to non-technical people, and they might be the people with the money that you're trying to convince for an exploration budget or something. So it's important to be able to distill down very technical work to any kind of audience. And then obviously, there's the need to manage conflicting priorities that can get thrown at you as you're trying to do your work. Time is constantly a pressure point, and you'll see that come up several times in the presentation here, and stress. And I think the stress is actually an important part and a healthy part of this job, which I'll get to in a minute as well. This is a picture of me finishing up a resource report on a plane, actually in Australia. I don't advise working this way. It's a very bad thing to do, to be at the last minute running stuff on the plane, but it happens. And then I kind of put just a tongue-in-cheek comment here at the bottom, aircon enthusiast. So I had a friend of mine, an Australian geo, who used to tease me and say, oh, corporate resource geology, you just, stay in the aircon and you're not a real geologist. And I think there's a certain amount of truth to it, because resource geologists do tend to spend more time in the office and more time in front of a computer. But it's important to, first of all, get field experience before you delve into this line of work, but also to try to maintain that contact with the field, to look at rocks and to talk to people who look at rocks. Go to the core shed, ask questions and be curious. You might be intimidated, you might look at core or an outcrop and think, I don't know what's going on here. I don't know what these minerals are, but ask questions, just as that person who's closer to the rocks might be uncomfortable, learning about variograms. And I think it's just important to keep that conversation going back and forth. So now we come to the pressure point. And if nothing else, for any newbies, retain this slide. And for those of you who have been in resource geology, you'll feel this is very familiar. I love this saying here from Spider-Man: with great power comes great responsibility. And a resource geologist has an insane responsibility. It really is an important job, and I see it as the foundation for so many other things, right? So I created this inverted pyramid with the resource geologist at the bottom holding up all this other stuff, all these other jobs and money that's ever increasing as you move up the pyramid. So mineral resources are estimated, and then you get a reserve calculated on top. A company might pay for a pre-feasibility, feasibility study in the millions of dollars, be laying out exploration budgets that are millions of dollars. And then a company can make a decision for mergers and acquisitions, to sink a shaft, to build a plant. And then on that same mineral resource, still, the company might go ahead and decide to put in rail or power or roads. And then come hundreds or thousands of direct and indirect jobs. Now, to me, when I do mineral resource estimates, I feel the weight of all this pressure, and I take it very seriously, and I get, kind of that sweaty, nervous feeling sometimes about what I'm producing, and I think it's good, because I think what we do is so important. And what I would advise to people is to have as many other colleagues as you can help you support this pyramid down at the bottom. So, whenever you can bring in someone to help give a second set of eyes, peer reviews, mining engineer to give you some help, a metallurgist, talk about some issues with the resources, field geologists, project geologists, get that help, accept the help, lessen the burden, and share that responsibility, because it's really quite weighty. Okay, the snakes are things that no matter how well you plan ahead, they pop up, right? So these you plan your certain amount of time that you've got to do your work, and then boom, the data is crappy, or boom, the time that you thought you had gets cut in half because there's another job to do. You've got other responsibilities coming in. Maybe your computer crashes and you end up with a blue screen of death like this. Some people have limitations on their software, so they just don't have license available to do the work that they need. That's a real problem that shouldn't happen, but it does. And then I would add, as a last one here, is macros and automation. I have a love-hate relationship with automation. It's amazing for saving time and for helping you have a reproducible audit or reproducible processes, but you should never trust your macros to do everything for you without checking them. I've seen lots of macros kind of mess things up, and they can be dangerous if they're not kind of handled carefully. Now the ladders, so these are the good things that help you get your job done faster, better, more enjoyably, and it's mostly about people. So here I've got two good friends of mine, two geologists that I respect tremendously, Gilles and Robert. There's a photo of them in Kazakhstan, and I think they're probably talking about directional drilling because it's something that they're both quite passionate about. And yeah, so just, I would say, whenever you have colleagues available to you, whether they're in your own company or whether it's someone you find on LinkedIn or in your professional association, really try and learn from them as much as you can. Rely on the code of practice. Looking at JORC reports, JORC Table 1 reports, 43101 reports is really helpful. It's really useful for you to learn on what needs to be included in a good report. And reading them, you'll learn ways to do it right, and then ways that are really hard to read, the technical reports that don't include a lot of important information, and they just make it very challenging for a technical person, let alone just, you know, an investor. So if you can, find someone who you know writes good reports and refer to their reports as a learning tool. And they're coming out every day, every week. So there are lots of reports out there to use. Data gems, old pieces of data. It might be a cross section that's got water stains and the edges are all ripped and it looks kind of old and useless. These things are precious, and sometimes they are the best sources of someone having thought about the geology a lot and put it to paper, and it can really give you a leg up on doing a geological interpretation. So those are really precious resources to help. And here I've added scripts and macros on the ladder side. So even though I did say previously that they could be snakes and they could kind of trip you up, they're also very helpful for saving time. So if you have these in your software, or you have a data science colleague who's a whiz at Python and they can build these for you, definitely use them because it'll make your life easier. Now comes the seduction, right? So for those of you who might not know who this is Paul Rudd, famous Hollywood actor. And right around the time that Jess and I were first starting to talk about me doing a GeoHug, People magazine named this fellow, Paul Rudd, as their sexiest man alive. So regardless of your opinion on Paul Rudd or whether there should be a sexiest man alive, we're going to use Paul as being the face of some non-technical external pressure that might come along when you're just trucking along, trying to do your work, and along comes Paul and puts pressure on you or puts a wrench in the work that you're trying to do. Usually in real life, it's not Paul Rudd, it's your manager. It might be a client. And they're exerting pressure because they are also receiving pressure from somewhere. So we'll give them a break, but still they're coming at you and asking to, you know, cut your time or do more work. And sometimes it's another number. So there might be a previous estimate for the deposit you're working on that has a historical estimate or a previous consultant or geologist estimate. And there's an expectation for you to either repeat or improve upon that number. And it could be tempting to apply a bias or to try and reproduce that number regardless of what your work is telling you. So you just have to be careful with these situations. And I would say when you're faced with seduction in your career, to always be careful of not sharing preliminary numbers. Paul is going to come up to you and say, hey, Lucy, I need your number. And I know you're not quite finished yet. Just give me a prelim and don't worry about it. As soon as that number leaves your email box or your hand, it's out there and it can be used. So be very wary of sharing preliminary figures. Always include recommendations in any report because it's part of your professional duty to improve things at the end of the day. Okay, so we've got through the players. We're ready to start. Anytime you see like a little blue box, it's because it's a ladder. So these are the good things. And then the orange boxes are the snakes that are tripping us up and causing us to go backwards. And the brown boxes is the seduction factor. So great. We have a ladder right off the bat. You have a great plan and a realistic plan for how you're going to use your time. Whether you've been given a week or a month or 3 months to prepare a resource estimate, you have to sit back and think about how I'm going to use my time. Just before I go into the details here, I'll say that any of these little images you see that have a little Etana Mining Mentors logo on them, these are figures that I'm going to add to my LinkedIn page and my website as PDFs for you to download and use. This is in no way a Bible or set in stone. It's really just a tool to help you develop your own workflows and to provide inspiration. This particular one is something I initially developed with another geo, Anna Shikini, great geologist and all around super person. So Anna, this is something that we built together, and then I've since adjusted it slightly. And what it is a list of all the steps that are required in preparing a mineral resource estimate, from a project kickoff all the way to transferring it to your mining engineer or whoever's going to be doing the next stage of work. And all of these numbers sum up to 100%. You might do the steps slightly differently. You might assign, more or less time, but this is kind of a general workflow of how I like to see the big picture. Starting with a project kickoff, which doesn't have to be formal, doesn't have to take a long time, but it's really just meant to sit down with your team. You might have someone who's a land administrator, someone who knows about the surface infrastructure, a project geologist, a mining engineer, and say, okay, what is the objective here? What's the purpose of this model that's being created? Does anyone have any concerns? Is there any kind of mineral that at the plant you need populated into the block model, and really just kind of set the stage of the work that's going to be done. And I think it's an important step to help you prepare for your work. Next comes the database validation that I put around 10%, but again, it depends a lot on the project. And then the third step is the biggest chunk of time. So the geological modeling, I've put here 25%. Many of you might argue it's highly variable. It really depends so much on the project. It depends on how much data you have, on the complexity of the geology. This is the crux and really the most important step, because if you get this wrong, you can't fix it in any of the remaining steps of the workflow. You're kind of, you've muffed it, and it's hard to come back from that. However, if you get the geological model right, you're really set up for success on the rest of the steps. So this is really the key step, is getting those volumes and the interpretation correct, and then everything else kind of flows through a little bit more logically. If you get stuck at any point during this workflow, I think there's typically 3 reasons that resource geologists tend to get stuck. One is that they're enjoying what they're doing. So I have one, friend who could spend 2-3 months on database validation. So he just loves it, and he might spend a little bit more time than most on that step. It might be but that you're intimidated by the next step to come, like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do with the density, so I'll just kind of hang around up here, or I don't like writing reports, so I'll put it off. Or maybe you just need help, right? So you're really stuck and you need to call a friend and get some help. But what I think is important to remember is when you have a certain allotment of time for either just yourself or for your team, if you take longer than you are meant to on your portion of the time, there are consequences. The first one is that it's going to cost money. So either your client's going to pay more, or your company's going to absorb more money. or it's going to cost someone else's time. So suppose as a team, you have 3 weeks to do all of your work, and you are supposed to take a week and a half, but you go to 2.5 weeks. Well, that means that everyone else, say the mining engineer or whoever's doing the cash flow at the end, they have to squeeze their work into a much shorter amount of time. So you really have to be conscientious of the steps that happen downstream after your own work. And then there's the 80-20 rule, which states that maybe those last little details that you're working on are not going to add that much value and are not going to make a huge difference to the end result. So you can get 80% of the results in 20% of the time, and just try and keep that in mind. What I like to do often is do a first quick run through of the entire process, get to the end, and then I know where the bugs for a particular project might be and where I'm going to have a bit more trouble. Then I go back to the start and refine each of the steps till I get it right. Okay, so we've just started, and already here comes Paul, and he says, hey, can you do this in 3 days? Now, we've just been through this long process of identifying that the workflow is huge. There are many different steps. And I think that is a way that you can justify to someone who's putting pressure on you. No, I have to do all these steps. I can't skip any of them. And if I do, these are the risks, right? And explain what you could be giving up if you try and cut steps, or if you try and deliver faster than was originally agreed upon. And as a professional, I think it's important to understand what your work is going to be used for, where it's going, and to set limits, because it's your professional reputation that is attached to every piece of work you do. So don't let the pressure get to you. Okay, so here's good news. Our validation of our database is a success. Now, if you're like me, you had a friend called Artur and Daniel who prepared these great Python notebook validation scripts, and it helps run through the data quickly and find some errors. These are auditable and repeatable. They're really handy to have. A lot of software packages have built-in validation tools as well. So those are great, and they help save time. However, I would always caution that any mistakes you find during your validation to return to the original database and correct it there. Otherwise, you're just going to keep seeing them again and again, and it gets a little bit irritating. And then always perform a visual check of the data after you've loaded it in space, because no matter how good your scripts may be, there are some errors that are hard to predict and hard to catch. So here's an example of some holes that were loaded into 3D. And what we can see is that the dips on these holes were wrong. They were inverted, and the elevation on this one was off. And when you see them in the context of the underground as-builts, you can see that there's a problem. But this particular kind of error may not have been picked up by a script. So visual check is really essential. And then a last piece of advice that I give here on the database is, if there's a way of quantifying or qualifying the accuracy of your database, it can be really helpful to decide which data to include or not into your model, into your estimate. And also it helps with your resource classification. Did I have very poor quality data to start with, and I'm not going to give a high confidence to my my resource estimate. So this is just a really quick and dirty database accuracy scorecard worksheet that I built up. And you would want to customize this for your particular setting, but you could give a scoring of 1 or poor all the way to excellent. And then for each of these different types of things that you want to score, you would have criteria for it to get a certain point score. For example, physical core record. If there's a complete archive of all of the core, it gets a 4, it's excellent. If it's just partial and the core is not fully preserved, it's a 3, all the way down to there is no physical record, we have no core, and that gets a 1. And then you can kind of sum up these scores for all the different kinds of data to assign a final classification in your database. And I find that it's quite helpful to see things in a more global, holistic way after you've reviewed the data. Okay, all right, so now we're happy with our QAQC. Many people have a QAQC database manager, which is great. They'll look at a lot of the details of all the QAQC, but the competent person is responsible for ensuring that the methodologies and the quality is adequate. And what I advise people to do, which I find really handy, is to have a QAQC on a page. So for every project you're working on, to try and summarize the major steps. This one is for assay data, but you could do it for survey and core photography or different types of information you're collecting. But to summarize the major steps so that it's really clear on what's being done at every step. So for example, at the database stage, what kind of security do we have? How is the core being prepped in the core shed? What kind of quality control samples are being included? The sample prep, where does that happen? What is the crush size, the lab location, package numbers, all the way through to analysis. And then finally, once the data is integrated in the database. So I think this is a really handy chart or tool for everyone to have to summarize what's being done for QAQC. And just kind of a word of advice is that there is absolutely no limit to the type of errors that can exist in a database. I'm sure you've all seen some pretty insane things. So keep a close eye on your data. Okay, geology, we had to get there, right? If the geology makes sense and everything hangs together, this is a big bonus for you. It's so important because having a good geological model lends credibility and lends robustness to everything else that you're going to do. You're going to choose the right analytical package, your drilling pattern will be appropriate, the interpretation will make sense. And what I would say, I mentioned earlier that often resource geologists are not as close to the rock. If you don't have that much time on the rock and you haven't handled a lot of the core yourself personally, then make friends with someone who does. So in my case here, Jorge Quispe is a geologist in Peru that I have tremendous respect for. He sat me down one day and drew this sketch, a more rough version of this sketch here. This is a refined one. But to explain the geological setting of a certain deposit we were looking at. He explained all the stratigraphic units, the controlling features on the mineralization, the different zonation for metals, and really just kind of blew my mind how he pieced it together from such a small fraction of information. So these kinds of people and this kind of information is really critical for a resource geologist to do a good job. Okay, volumetric matching. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I've actually written a newsletter that I'm going to post on my LinkedIn. It's going to be called the Mineral Resource Beacon, but it's a really simple, quick and dirty check to make sure that when you move from a wireframe to blocks, that the volume is maintained. Very basic, very easy to do, but you can over or underestimate volume of mineral resources if this is done incorrectly. So just keep an eye on that. Oh, so now problem, guys, you've ignored the weathering. So weathering in deeper deposits or under glacial cover, maybe we're not as concerned about, but when there is a weathering profile, it's critical that is incorporated into the model. So this cross-section here of a purple mineralization shape is not the same thing at all as the shape on the right, where we have a really well-modeled transition from overburden to transition zone to, or oxide to transition to sulfide zone. And it's important to understand those different units, how it transitions from the surface to fresh rock, to understand where the changes happen, how variable the changes are along the extents of the deposit, and how certain we are of where that changes is, because it can be highly variable. And the impact of, knowing or not knowing the weathering transition is huge on so many different factors, right? So it'll impact the grades, obviously. Grades might be higher or lower depending on where you are in the profile. So the contained metal could be different. The in situ value of the mineralization, where infrastructure might be put, so the pilings for a plant, where the portals location is going to go, geotech parameters for an open pit, recovery at the mill, power that's required for comminution. So many different things will vary depending on how the weathering changes. So that's important to keep it in mind. Okay, here's Paul is back at us again, and he's saying, oh, there's this other stuff I need you to get done. Can you just do them both at the same time and get them done? It's really important. This happens. Be prepared for it, again, to justify, why you need a certain amount of time to do your job, but also be a little bit flexible and try and think of ways that you could move things along more quickly, maybe by getting some help from another colleague, from an external source. And I just put here, jokingly, should I skip the validation? And that's a never, right? That's super critical. We never do that. But also you would want to be explicit about what you're expected to deliver for the different assignments, say that your manager is giving you. And we do lose efficiency if we try and do several things at once, running back and forth from different projects, different software, writing 2 reports at once. It doesn't work. We waste a lot of time. And what I find is quite helpful in this kind of situation is to say, okay, you've got this new priority for me. Well, I need you to tell me what gets deprioritized. And that kind of helps the manager or the client think about, okay, well, I do have to choose at a certain point, and they help you make that decision. Although I'm guessing that people in consulting would say every client has to be the most important, and they don't care about your other priorities that you have going on. Okay, this is a huge one. There's a lot of ugly pictures I put up here for you. We see these a lot in the industry. We have this amazing software that helps us make beautiful shapes, very fast, very reproducible, and they look great, but we can also do a lot of damage with some of the software that we have. So one of the errors that we'll see often, I call smarties. And these are tiny little bubbles or blebs that are situated around isolated drill holes. These are cool, targets, and maybe you want to drill between these 2 holes, for example, and see if things link up. These are not mineral resources, right? These are just isolated hits of, anomalous mineralization, and these need to be barred from reported mineral resources. The next one are lightning bolts. Depending on an anisotropy that can be applied to a geological model, what you can end up with is like a wireframe that kind of cuts in and out of a drill hole. So just going in and out like this, which may be fine. Perhaps that's what the mineralization does. It's very discontinuous, but what it's creating is this false blowout of volume behind that's not representative of the discontinuous mineralization. This quantity of volume is not fair with respect to the amount of mineralization we have over here. Same thing in this image. We've got a kind of in and out pattern going through anomalous mineralization and waste. And yet we've created this giant bubble of volume in between, and that's not justified. So we can clearly see the data is telling us the mineralization is discontinuous. And now I've got a big bubble that I'm pretty sure if anyone tried to mine this is not ore. And then the last one are pin cushions. So by nature of the algorithms that produce the wireframes, what we can end up having is where a drill hole pierces a volume it honors the mineralized intercept, and then it kind of just puffs out a little bit, particularly when you don't have a lot of data. So it puffs out on the edges and creates unwarranted volume. So in this case, I've just shown the wireframe that's been created is this sort of green outline. But if you were to manually draw this wireframe, likely you would do something more similar to the gray line. So be wary of pincushions that can be produced in your models. Okay, missing data. So we're kind of backtracking a little bit and looking at absent data, but how absent data in the database is handled will impact a lot of downstream processes and results downstream. So for example, this is twice the same wireframe and the same data, but on the left, what I've done is taken all of the data that's at detection limit and just removed it. So we say, oh, that data was not sampled. We don't know why, but we pretend it doesn't exist. And estimating with this quantity of data gives us this kind of football-shaped anisotropy, this variogram with this particular range, that now if I replace that data with a very low value, maybe half detection limit or something, gives an entirely different picture, right? So the circulates will be different, the variogram ranges will be different, anisotropy is different, and then obviously the block grades are very different. So this is really important to understand why data is missing and to carefully handle it in the estimation, because it's going to have a huge impact on the result. Okay, just a little bit about validation. So obviously validation, super critical step, never can be skipped. And I would suggest always use at least 3 different methods to validate, and visual is a must. Every step of the way, in fact, you should be looking at what you've done. You make composites, look at what you've done. You make a wireframe, look at what you've done. You've made a block prototype, take a look at it in 3D, because it's easy to make small mistakes there. Here's an example of a swath plot. So essentially we've just sliced across the area of our mineralization, and we're looking at how does the resultant block model compare to the input data that I pushed in at the start. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, this sort of tannish brown line is the original drill hole data. These are grades. I think it's a zinc grade in this case. And it tends to be a little bit more variable, a bit more erratic. And then the green line represents the blocks. So once I've taken those grades from the drill hole data and I've populated in my block model, what I want to see is that the blocks are more or less representative of the original data. What I see in this case, for example, is that I've got about 12 points, 12 slices in my swath plot here, and 9 of them are below the block grades. So 9 of these brown points are below or less than the green points, and only 3 of these are above. What that tells me is that in all of these cases where the dots are below, the grade in the blocks is actually higher than my original grade, and this is problematic. Potentially I have an overestimation of the grade in this area. What I can also see is that the line of block grades is quite flat, and there may be a little bit too much smoothing. Typically, you would want the block grade histogram to kind of vary along and follow the composite or assay data. So there's maybe a little bit of a problem, and I want to go and zoom into this area, check it for bugs, and maybe adjust my kriging plan to get it more representative of input. Here's another validation that I like to do, which is just to overlay the original assay grades and my blocks with the same color scheme. And what I want to see is, where I have a lot of yellow assay grades, which is, I think, let's just check, between 0.1 and 0.5 grams per ton gold. I want to see that the blocks underneath that area have about the same grade. So this is looking good here. I'm happy. Here I've got, matching assay grades and block grades. That's cool. It's looking good. But I do have this area over here that I've circled that's kind of problematic. It's bugging me a bit. So these blocks are all in the 1 to 2 grams per ton. But if I look in the vicinity around here, there are not so many 1 to 2 gram per ton assay values. I've got a lot of greens and a lot of yellows. So what I would do in this case at the validation step is go in and try and figure out where's the data that's populating these blocks and giving it this higher grade, and is that justified? Maybe just off the section there's another high grade hole and it's okay, but it does bring my attention in and I want to check it. And then something else that is always a good validation is to look at, similar to the swath plot, similar to the section we just looked at, but is comparing histogram of the input to histogram of the output. So here we've got some silver grades, and the histogram has a certain variability with a mean grade of 68 grams per ton. 50th percentile is 55 grams per ton. And I can see that, 75% of my data sits in this range between 25 and 100. Okay, those are the characteristics of that population. Now, what I'd like to see is that when I perform a block estimate and I move that data into blocks, that it's more or less the same. Of course, accounting for clustering and data redundancy and things like that. What I can see here in the inverse distance estimate is that the mean is roughly the same. That's good. My 50th percentile grade is a little bit high compared to what I had in the raw data. And I can also see that now I've got 94% of my data or my block grades within this range from 25 to 100. So by nature of how estimation works, it tends to smooth things out and move closer to the average. So we would expect a little bit more of the squeezing of this histogram here. But what could concern me is, let's suppose that at this deposit we had a 100 gram per ton cutoff, right? In the data, we've got 16% of our assay points that are above 100 grams. But once I have transformed those into blocks, only 6%. So I could be underestimating this higher grade population. And this is what we refer to as change of support. So it's really important when doing validation that whatever you make, whatever you produce in your blocks is roughly equivalent to or representative of the input data. We're getting to the end. A couple more steps. Reblocking. So depending on the type of software you're using, you are often creating subblocks. So you might have a parent cell size of, let's say, 5 by 5 by 5 meters, and then you subblock it into small segments to be able to properly represent the volume of your wireframe. And then depending on what happens with those subblocks later on down the line, they might need to be reblocked up again or aggregated into larger block sizes for, let's say, open pit optimization purposes. The macros or the tools that certain software packages have do this job for you, right? So it's quite handy, but you always need to check the results, because it is possible to have a bit of a flub here and to not accurately represent that whole volume, which has ore and waste in it, in the final larger block. So I'll just use this image here to explain it a bit better, which is that we start out with our mineralization having a handful of small chopped up little blocks, and then the white area is waste, no grade, different density. What I want to do is now take this volume and represent it as a single larger block. And what I need to do is create a weighted average of this higher grade material and the waste, both for density and grade. And the end result should be a lower grade, but larger full size block. It is possible to not properly weight that and create a bigger block, but with all high grade. And this effectively is creating metal, inventing metal that doesn't exist. So this is an important validation to do if you need to transform your block model in any way. Same thing goes for this case over here, where we've taken a model and subblocked it against this shape, this pale red shape, that's my ore wireframe. I've created subblocks based on that. But then when I try and filter out the blocks that have been mined from my depletion shape, so this green outline, I can see that there's a mismatch, and I'm either going to be removing too much material or not removing material that's actually been depleted. So it's good to do a visual check on the subblocking after you've depleted your model. Resource classification is a big one. We could spend a week on this. I'll just say very quickly, my top three that I think are the most important are quality of your data, quantity of your data, and geology. So the complexity of the geology and your confidence in your interpretation. I think the most popular and most common one that we see in tech reports is drill hole spacing, and a lot of statistical parameters that are calculated, kriging variance and that kriging efficiency, are related to drill hole spacing. The most misused is the variogram range. So variograms do tell you something about continuity of grade within a shape, but they shouldn't be used for classification purposes. And then the most forgotten one is density. People tend to just kind of slap a density on at the end of the day and not think that that has an impact on classification, but it really should. And here I've just pulled a couple of examples from tech reports that I've seen. This person said here, all other blocks were classified as inferred. To me, that says nothing. You could have a wireframe that extends for 3 kilometers, fill it with blocks and grades, and then just call it inferred. So that it has no information about geology or data. This next example is quite a bit better. So it's saying inferred resources were defined for blocks informed by at least 2 drill holes and within 60 meters of a hole. So it's at least giving me a little bit to go on as to, depending on the geology, what could be the potential confidence of that material. And then here I would just add a caution about beware resource buffers. So in this example, the green represents a measured resource, the blue would be indicated, and the purple is an inferred resource. And generally there should be a difference between inferred and indicated in terms of the data that's underlying the classification, but in this whole area, there is no data in either of them. So what makes these blocks any better or any more confident than the purple ones? And it's really just proximity to the other data. Whoop. Okay, model fitness for downstream users. This is a quick and easy one. Make sure that the extents of your block model are suitable for whoever's going to be using it after. Make sure your file format is tidy. Remove any fields that are unnecessary. Often the mining engineers don't care about kriging efficiency. They don't care about your nearest neighbor estimate. So make it clean. Make the descriptors obvious. Never double rotate just because you can. It doesn't mean that you should. This is bad behavior and they won't like you for it. So think about your friends downstream. Oh, Paul Rudd is not happy with our number. So he says, no, you were expecting twice that number and all is measured. Now, this happens and particularly in consulting, I think that you produce a number and the client is not happy. They're expecting more grade, they're expecting more tons, they're expecting a higher classification. And really you're the professional, you're signing the report, it's your name. You need to defend your work, and everything that you've done leading up to this point lends confidence to your work, and you need to be courageous and stand your ground. And it helps to often have a peer or a mentor support you, review your work. But your responsibility is, as I mentioned earlier, to all of those downstream investments and all of the jobs that are coming thereafter. So don't bend to this kind of pressure. And you're done. So you made it. When you're finished, have a checklist to make sure everything is done. You've completed your reports, you filed all your documents. Check, check, check again. Take some notes on how you can improve things for next time, and then try and help someone else. If there's a younger geo who you want to share some knowledge with and help train the next generation, do so. Share your knowledge, and I know that it's a very generous community. So that's my overview, and I hope it was helpful or humorous or reminds you of some ugly things that you've seen in your own line of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was unreal.